Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Northshire online event. Thank you all so much for being here with us this evening. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rachel Person. I'm the event manager for Northshire Bookstore in Saratoga Springs, New York. Here, as I so often am these days, with my good friend and colleague, Davith Wood, event manager for Northshire Bookstore in Manchester Center, Vermont. Davith is going to introduce our guests in just a couple of minutes. Before we do that, just a couple of very quick notes. First of all, you may have seen as you were coming in that this event is being recorded for future broadcast on our YouTube channel. However, we have the settings arranged so that only those of us who are unmuted and speaking will be recorded, so we are not recording you for you. In light of that, please use the chat box to post any questions that you have throughout the evening. You can put them in there and we will save them up, and Davith and I will pose those questions for you when we get to the audience question and answer session at the end of the night. And then last of all, a word of thanks. It's been a tough couple of years in independent bookselling world, and we couldn't have continued to exist without your ongoing support. So we thank you very much for continuing to support Northshire Bookstore and for being with us tonight. Thank you all so much and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It is my great pleasure to welcome back to Northshire, virtually this time, Joseph J. Ellis, one of the country's leading scholars of American history, for his latest book, The Cause, The American Revolution and Its Discontents, 1773 to 1783. A professor emeritus at Mount Holyoke, he is the best-selling author of 12 previous books, including American Sphinx, the character of Thomas Jefferson, which won the National Book Award, and Founding Brothers, the Revolutionary Generation, which won the Pulitzer Prize. His latest book, The Cause, is a Northshire staff pick, an editor's choice from the Times Book Review, one of the best reads for right now by the Chicago Tribune, and has been called one of the most exciting and engaging histories of America's founding in decades. The Washington Post called it a seriously entertaining book and a lively addition to the literature, while the New York Review of Books called it a special gift, the book the author most wanted to write to the reader from the great scholar. And we're lucky to be joined tonight by Professor Robert J. Allison, professor of history at Suffolk University and the Harvard Extension School. He is the author of numerous books on American history, most recently, The American Revolution, A Very Short Introduction. And he'll be he'll be publishing a new book on the U.S. Constitution soon. Please join me in welcoming to Northshire Professors Robert Allison and Joseph Ellis. I'll take it away.
Great, thank you, David, and thank you, Rachel, and thank you everyone for joining us. So, Joe, the subtitle of the book is The American Revolution and Its Discontents. What do you mean by the discontents? Who are they?
I was afraid you're going to ask me that one first, and but that gave me some time to think. Two or three things. That patriotism began to decline during what we call the American Revolution, almost before the ink was dry on the Declaration of Independence. It didn't disappear, it receded to the local level, I think. But what was at the beginning of the war called rage militaire, a kind of commitment among all the colonies to support this effort, was short-lived. And one of the stories in the book is the story of the treatment of the Continental Army, which is kept on life support throughout much of the war. If in fact Washington had gotten what he asked for in terms of troops and money, we could have raised an army of 60 to 80,000 and ended the war in a year or two. At least he thought that, and so did Hamilton. So one meaning of discontents is the failure of the entire society to provide support for this war. And in the end, it was a war that we almost lost because of that. So that's one sense of the meaning. The other big one is that at the end of the war, what we created was not a nation. Lincoln can be forgiven at Gettysburg for being historically correct when he said, 70 years ago, our fathers brought forth from this continent a new nation. Not really. Of course, he had in 1863, it was important for him to be able to say that. But we brought brought to bear not a nation, but a confederation of sovereign states, the so-called Articles of Confederation. And what that meant was that the two looming tragedies that will emerge from the founding as the great tragedies, the failure to put slavery on the road to extinction and the failure to reach some kind of satisfactory arrangement or just arrangement with the indigenous people would be politically impossible to do. And I think that we'll talk about those tragedies later on, I suspect. And the way I'd put it is that we have to think about them and ask ourselves whether they're Greek tragedies or Shakespearean tragedies. That is to say, whether they were embedded in the history in a way that couldn't have been avoided with even great leadership, or whether great leadership by the founding generation could have turned them around. At any rate, those are the two biggies, the two discontents. I feature one chapter in the book called The Few. It's about what it was like to be at Valley Forge that winter. And that's the real, low point. And and I've come to really appreciate in the writing and research of this book, the ordinary soldier in the Continental Army, who in many cases never got a pension, and when he went home was especially in Connecticut and Massachusetts, almost treated as if he was a loyalist, because they were afraid he was going to cost them money in terms of pensions. Anyway, a little bit of a long-winded answer to your first question, but discontents in those two important senses.
Now, the title, of course, is The Cause, and you make the point that few talked about it as the revolution, but it was
Right.
the cause. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, nobody called it the American Revolution until after it was over. The British called it the American Rebellion. The term "the cause" isn't original with me. That's what they called it. Mm-hmm. Initially, they called it the Common Cause, and it was shortened to the Cause. The Common Cause was the rally of 13 separate colonies to support the people of Massachusetts, and especially Boston, when the occupation occurs after passage of the Coercive Acts. But that's shortened to the Cause, and the Cause becomes a convenient umbrella or a convenient term that could shift meanings and expand or contract during the war. Washington wanted it to expand to mean this is a war for American nationhood, and so did Hamilton. But in some ways, the cause contracts to mean that we are provisionally united to win this war and then go our separate ways as states afterwards. But I've seen some reviews that said, Ellis is a corny term, the cause, what a corny title. It comes from them. That's what they said. It's their word, not mine. And I'm trying to play on it and call to its ambiguity, its ambivalence. Different groups could read different things into what it meant. If you ask anybody in the 13 colonies during the war, what does the cause mean? They would point to Washington. Whatever he is, that's it. But it's an elusive term, but a conveniently elusive term. And it's the one they coined themselves.
So does the war itself actually change the way they thought of one another and they thought of the incipient nation? The fighting of the war?
I think that there's at the local level, it's really important, and I hope we'll play this out in greater detail in subsequent questions, but that control of the ground at the local level was all important. Mm-hmm. It was the ultimate reason why the British could not win the war. Here's the scene. Here's a few sentences Tell me whether they sound familiar. An emerging great power, brimming over with confidence, assured of its military and economic supremacy, steps into a quagmire and a war that is unwinnable and unnecessary. That should sound pretty familiar to a lot of us Americans.
Mhm.
And that's exactly what happened to the Brits. And why is it unwinnable? It's unwinnable because it will require the occupation of the entire country for the indefinite future. And that is logistically, economically impossible. And Lafayette, at one point, when he's told that the British are going to attack him in Virginia, and says, well, the British could run an army all the way from St. Augustine to Boston, winning all the way. And behind them, the waves would close and they would have only alienated people and be further from victory. People on the ground were all important in this particular war. And now, I don't know whether the war itself, our images of the war are shaped by most of the art that was done by contemporaries or soon after the war. Trumbull, the big artist, Charles Wilson Peale, another, maybe Copley, but less so, Gilbert Stuart. It gives us a kind of war of etiquette almost, a polite war, a romantic war. There's no Matthew Brady there to take photographs of the dead. And I think if we had Brady or if we had Goya, we would think of the war differently. It was a brutal war.
Mhm.
One of the reasons that the militia always ran away in conventional battles, and they did, was that you had to be disciplined and you had to be a veteran to behave as you needed to behave. The British are coming at you at 100 meters and closing the distance, and you've got to be able to stand still while the guy next to you is disemboweled or beheaded. You've got to be able to reload 4 times in a minute rather than twice. You've got to be able to move to oppose a flanking movement by the Brits or to engage in a strategic retreat as a group. So you have to be trained to a 28-inch regular step, a 32-inch fast step, and you have to be able to reload while moving. It really takes a long time to be able to do all those things. And the Continental Army becomes the equivalent of the British Army by the very end of the war when it's no longer necessary. But that it's a brutal war, and per capita, only the Civil War saw more American casualties than the American Revolution. And so the war itself needs to be reimagined. And I hope nobody in the film or miniseries world has yet done this effectively, I think. And maybe that's something that we can look for. But brutality, barbarism, and in the countryside. So you're living in New Jersey, and the 2 armies are moving about foraging for food. And the British Army comes through with Hessians, or worst of all, loyalists. The loyalists are the worst. And if you don't cooperate, they take you out of the house, they rape the women in front of the husband, they hang the husband in front of the children, and then they burn the house down. In New Jersey and the Western Carolinas, there are several thousand people who died in the war in that kind of way that aren't counted. You know, there are no grave sites for them or anything, but it's an unconventional war there. It's a brutal war. And in the South, there was retribution. It's really two groups of terrorists, the British loyalist terrorists and the American terrorists, going house to house. And it's almost like, it's tribal. And the kind of scene I described is familiar. The officer in the British Army who's commanding the unit that's doing the killing and raping is off smoking his pipe, pretending like he doesn't notice what's going on. I'm going on myself too long here, but the war is different from the most popular images, and I hope some of that's recovered in this book.
I think it is. It really does bring that home. I do wonder why there haven't been any films that depict the war the way it was.
I tried to. I was involved with Ken Burns when he was doing. Ken Burns is actually putting together a documentary on the American Revolution. He's got about 5 projects going at the same time, but that's probably going to air in a couple of years. And he does documentaries, so he doesn't have to have actors or anything to replicate. But he said he told me a story. He said, "What's the name of one of the great directors in the 20s and the 30s who did a lot of these epic films?" Was asked. Cecil B. DeMille, thank you. Why he never made a movie about Washington. And because he made one about Lincoln, he said, whatever we do to depict Washington will disappoint viewers, that no actor can play him. He's boring, flat, but he's the greatest leader in American history. But that it's impossible, in other words, in a popular medium to convey him successfully. I don't think that's true myself anymore anyway. And so maybe we'll see it with Ken Burns, or there is a mini series in process, although it's not sure it's going to happen. I think it was bought by Disney for airing on FX, 13-part series on Washington and his manservant, Billy Lee, who I do a profile on in the book. It's still not sure. And 95% of these projects die. They never, because they're very expensive. But I'm going to be a consultant on that. And if I could get my 2 cents in there, you'll see something unusual in the characterization of Washington. But again, so many of these things fail.
Yeah. So you said, Washington is boring. I would recommend reading your book about him, which doesn't make him seem boring. But you also talk about some of the other characters who are part of the story: Joshua Loring, Mercy Otis Warren, Henry Washington, Katie Green. It's an interesting array of characters you chose to illustrate different points of this. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about your choices and who these folks are.
Perhaps being overly clever, somewhere in the introduction, I think I say I've made my choice of characters on the Casablanca principle. That is to say, I've rounded up the usual suspects. And that's true at the highest level. And the usual suspects are Washington, Jefferson, John Adams, less Sam. Sam should be more featured, but I'm saving it for Stacey Schiff. Hamilton, Madison's not so big, but the people, there's a lower tier of people that I think belong in the top tier. They were thought of at the time as equals, and those include John Jay, Nathaniel Greene, who's Washington's second in command and would take over if Washington went down. Robert Morris, who gets vilified in a lot of the biographies until fairly recently, and he really saves the army many times with his own money. And then there's a third group of people, and you mentioned some of them, like Katie Green's, Nathaniel Green's wife. And she becomes the angel of Valley Forge. She wears her fancy dresses and high heels amidst the snow, going to the different little, what do they call those things there, the little cabins that they have, and listening to the soldiers who were dying or talk about their families and reading them books. She's an interesting character, and she ends up, Nathaniel dies of suddenly of some sort of heat stroke. She inherits his plantation outside of Savannah. She's got 4 kids, and she writes to the president of Yale, Ezra Stiles, and says, "Can you send me a tutor down here?" And guess who he sends? It's the guy that invents the cotton gin,
Eli Whitney.
Eli Whitney. And Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin with Katie standing there in her plantation. I mean, she has an interesting life.
Mhm.
And there are people like that that are normally not featured as characters in the story. And she's one of them. I guess the other one you mentioned is Harry Washington. Nobody knows who Harry Washington is except some people down at Mount Vernon. Harry Washington is a slave at Mount Vernon who escapes to the British Army. In Virginia, about 300 such slaves escape. Most of them die of smallpox. By most of them, over half of them die of smallpox within a few months. But Harry doesn't die. And the slaves from Mount Vernon, none of them died because they were inoculated by Washington at the start of the war. Harry ends up in New York at the end of the war, sent to Nova Scotia, marries. He had to leave his wife and kid in Mount Vernon, never saw him again, but he remarries in Nova Scotia. He lives there for 10 years and then joins a group of 1,000 African-American loyalists who decide that they're being mistreated by the white loyalists. And it's too cold up there anyway. And they move to Sierra Leone, back to Africa. And he lives there for 5 years. And then there's a fight with the Brits there about their being taxed without their consent, which you can't make this kind of stuff up. And Harry joins the insurrection. And most of the leaders in the insurrection are killed. They're executed, but they don't kill him because he's too old by then. Wow. And he lives out the last few years of his life with his wife in an African village, not far from Sierra Leone, from Freetown. And that's a great story. And he doesn't have anything directly to do with the shape that the war or the American Revolution will take, but he's a character that people ought to know more about. And there's going to be a painting put up to him of him in Mount Vernon sometime soon, and the people who visit there will be able to hear the story of Harry and he's back at Mount Vernon at last.
It's amazing. You've just outlined what would be a great movie, the story of Harry Washington.
Yeah. And because there's so many things that you don't know, you can make a lot of stuff up. As long as you don't violate what we know is historically correct, you have some license, it seems to me. Now, I'm not a novelist, but I hope that historians have some imaginative rights anyway. And I'd love to advise that particular film if it ever came to be. But I think Harry's going to start to become semi-famous because 1 million people a year visit Mount Vernon and go through that. And he's going to be featured, I do believe.
Good. Very good. Another group that we don't think of a lot in thinking about the revolution, of course, are the French, who play a pivotal role. And you mentioned that, Washington and Rochambeau initially are very much disappointed in the other. When they first meet,
Washington says, "How come there's only 5,000 of you?" And Rochambeau just looks at the men that are with him, the Continental soldiers. They look like a ragtag, barefoot, scroungy group. Both men changed their mind because they beef up the size of the French army in Newport to 10,000. And Rochambeau later, because at Yorktown, he watches these guys fight. Mm-hmm. And they might not look like soldiers, but by that time, they're veteran soldiers. They are tough hombres. And he's very impressed with that. But I think it's fair to say that I don't know whether we would have lost the war, but I think the way we won the war was only possible because of the French. Mm-hmm. I mentioned much earlier that the individual states were not paying their taxes for the war. Like $8 million is requested in 1778. they get $38,251. The soldiers don't have food. The soldiers don't have uniforms. The French spend over twice as much money supporting the Continental Army than the American colonies do. In fact, think about this. The French go so deeply in debt paying for the American Revolution that this becomes the catalyst that produces the French Revolution, because they have to call the Estates General because they're bankrupt. And that's where the trouble starts and leads to the French Revolution. But the Battle of Yorktown is especially a French operation. Again, without the French Navy at that moment, it couldn't have been won. And so I do think it was appropriate when the American Expeditionary Force landed in France in 1917, a junior officer, but I think he was a West Pointer, said, "Lafayette, we are here," and we owed him. And so the French were absolutely essential. In fact, once the French went in 1778, from that point forward, I can't see how anybody in London or Whitehall could imagine that they could win the war. I mean, because you see, what that did to them is it wasn't just the French support for the Americans, but it meant the British had to defend their entire empire, the Caribbean and India and the Mediterranean. So it drew them off in all those ways. There was a real division in the British ministry on this. Let's just abandon the American theater and get on with the serious business of defending the rest of the empire. But until the very end, George III and Lord George Germain believed they could somehow pull it out, but they couldn't.
Yeah. And of course, in 1777 and 78, the British send a peace commission to try to negotiate a settlement. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's called they called itself the Carlisle Commission after Lord Carlisle, one of its leading members. By this time, they realized, we thought this was going to be like breaking an egg. It's more like cracking a nut. And the casualty rates are up, and this is not the war they thought it was going to be. And let's negotiate. And they offered terms to the Americans that are even more generous than the terms the Americans themselves had proposed in 74, 75. At the time, it was, let's just go back to the way it used to be before you started taxing us, back to 1763, and recover that kind of relationship. Let us tax ourselves. We'll stay in the empire. The Carlisle Commission says, we'll give you everything you wanted. Not only that, we'll let you keep the Continental Congress. We'll do everything you want. And by then, however, it's too late. Too many men and women have died. Too many women have been raped. There's again, what I haven't mentioned, like certain towns like current Portland, which was then called Falmouth, burned to the ground, 3,000 people. Norfolk, same thing. Towns in Connecticut, because the British fleet was totally unopposed in those areas. And so that the suffering that had occurred made anything less than American independence non-negotiable. Washington was afraid that because people were tired of the war, that they might be vulnerable to this offer. And the head of the Continental Congress at the time, a South Carolinian, Henry Lawrence, and he conferred. And basically, nobody ended up knowing what the British had actually proposed. And they didn't release it to the newspapers for fear that it would inspire a popular reaction that was, let's get over with this war.
Well, you said earlier that, or quoting Nathaniel Greene, that the British could not win the war. Do you think it would have been possible for the Americans to lose the war?
Yes. If you take Yorktown out of the equation, suppose, and at Yorktown, the luck was evenly divided. The British had all the bad and the Americans and French had all the good. And it had to happen in just a certain way and in a certain kind of, but suppose that hadn't happened. There was a principle of diplomacy called uni possidetis, It means keep what you possess.
Mhm.
And several European powers, including Russia, Austria, had proposed that there be a negotiated settlement in the war. It was hurting their economies, and whoever occupied certain ground kept it. That's one way the war could have ended, because the Americans were exhausted at the end as well, and the Continental Army was in tatters. And what that would have produced is in my judgment, the result would be that independence was maintained north of the Chesapeake, maybe from Delaware up. The rest of the states would have remained within the British Empire. And that's an interesting resolution. And by the way, if that had happened, some of my colleagues think Great Britain ended slavery in 1772. They didn't end slavery until 1833. They would have been very supportive of the Cotton Kingdom, et cetera, et cetera. But it could have ended that way. It wouldn't have been a total defeat. In other words, a total defeat, which almost happened at the very beginning of the war in the Battle of Long Island, would have meant the Continental Army is destroyed. Washington and his colleagues are taken to London, given a show trial, hanged, and then their heads cut off and put on a spit. And that would have been the way it ended. So it would have ended the same way that in Scotland or in Ireland, the British victory ended. Total, but that, of course, did not happen. But there was a middle way it could have happened, but it didn't.
Then as you said, the Continental Army is exhausted, the country is broke, and the Congress is completely ineffectual. And in March of 1783, some of Washington's officers get the idea of they are essentially the only force that has been able to do anything.
They're the only, they're the only symbol of unity left.
Yeah.
And they're being nobody's been paid for 2 years. They're going broke. The officers are in debt, and when they're afraid when they're going to get out, they're going to be arrested and put in debtor's prison. And there is a series of conversations in the officer class when the Army's at Newburgh. There are two groups. One, under Horatio Gates, wants to threaten to overturn a mutiny, and that unless they're paid, they're not going to fight anymore. And if the war ends, they're going to go to the West and be a revolutionary or some sort of rebel force out there. There's another group, more moderate group, that simply says, let's use our potential power to do that as a lever or leverage to extract some concessions from the Congress in terms of pensions, especially. Washington finds out about this, and when the meeting is scheduled, he walks in, and they don't think he's coming, but he shows up, and he's ready. Now, I don't know whether he wrote this speech that he gave then. It could have been Hamilton, because Hamilton was doing a lot of correspondence for him. But he gives one of the best speeches of his life and basically says, look, I've been with you all the way. I love you. But we cannot violate the principles of the very revolution we have been fighting to win. We cannot abandon them, and we will do that. And if you think about it, that's the way it often turns out in especially in countries that claim to be republics. I mean, that's how you get Caesar. That's how you got Cromwell. Think about what Napoleon did. Think about what Lenin did. Think about what Mao did. Think about what Castro did. And so the pattern is for the leading military figure to declare himself a dictator. And Washington simply will not do that. And as a student of Washington, it wasn't hard for him. He didn't want to be dictator. He really didn't. And no president in American history did not want to be president more than George Washington. The moment occurs again in Annapolis shortly later when he goes there, because that's where the the Congress is moving about like an itinerant roadshow, and it's in Annapolis at this time. And there he surrenders his commission and his sword,
Mhm.
and then just walks out.
Yeah.
Billy Lee beside him,
Mhm.
and rides back to Mount Vernon. And Jefferson, writing to someone shortly thereafter, says, "This is, the character of one man prevented this revolution from concluding the way others have done."
Mhm.
And when word is broken to George III, or is provided to him, it's by an American artist who tells him this, that Washington has refused the crown, Washington has refused to become the dictator, George III says, if he did that, he will be the greatest man in the world. He did, and for at least that moment, he was.
You say that no one noted that the day they had called this meeting was March 15th.
Oh, the Ides of March. Yes, that's
And-
right.
And
Nobody,
the only American who could have played the role of Caesar declined the part.
that's right. I said it. Thank you for reminding me of how I said that.
Another of the characters you profile is Joseph Brant, the Mohawk Warrior. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the role Native Americans play. You mentioned this is one of the big
Failures,
tragedies at the end of the war.
Right. Just as the Americans had no chance of winning the war without the French, the British had no chance of winning the war without a large supply of loyalists and Native Americans. And the Iroquois Confederation in upstate New York had sided with the Brits during the French and Indian War. And a man whose English name becomes Joseph Brant was the child of one of the people that had worked with the British, and his sister actually married the major British commander there. And Brant is the leader of the Mohawk tribe. He's educated at a school that will eventually be called Dartmouth College. He's educated in Latin and Greek, and he becomes a Christian. And he's sort of trotted out and goes to London as the not the savage, but the epitome of the noble savage. Although even when in London, he's always wearing a tomahawk. And he heads up an insurrection in the Hudson Valley and in Western New York that decimates the white population there, and decimates the population of another tribe. It's not what's the tribe that doesn't go along with the Brits, and it's pretty cutthroat.
Mhm.
And it's true that the Brits are providing the Native American troops, siding with them, with 50,000 steel-bladed knives. And though it's not true that they were paying them on a per scalp basis at least from London, that's what happens on the ground during the war in upstate New York. So it's a horrible thing.
Mhm.
And Washington says we cannot allow this to be happening with impunity, and no militia is going to be able to defeat Joseph Brant, whose opinion he thought very highly of Brant as a military commander. So Washington sends 5,000 troops up, and it's too much. And there are not that many casualties in the series of encounters because the Native Americans flee before the force and flee up to Canada, and Brant among them. It's one of the reasons why the Iroquois understand from the start that that if America wins the war, it's really bad news for them.
Mhm.
If the Brits win it, they can preserve some measure of autonomy. Brant lives on in Canada for several years. He becomes disenchanted with the British treatment of Native Americans and the promises they make, some they can't keep. And eventually does. But Brantford is named after him, and he's a hero in Canada. But in New York, the other tribe I was thinking of is the Oneida. He's a murderer. I mean, he's a person who perpetrated great massacres. I feature him to make sure that we get a Native American into this story, and a nice picture of him. There's a beautiful picture of him done by Ramsey, a prominent British artist. And in the same way that you talk about the choices that Billy Lee made to stay with the revolution, where Harry Washington made the other side, you can understand why Grant, makes the decisions he does. In fact, Washington at one point says, if I was Grant, I'd be doing the same thing he is. But if you happen to be a settler living in the Hudson Valley, however, and you walk by your neighbors and see all the kids scalped and pigs eating the bodies, you have a different view of these things.
Yeah. Just thinking about, again, the end of the war, the way it does not end in a military dictatorship. One of the real themes you have in the book is this tension between the Continental Authority, local authority, and it seems to be the key to all of this. And
Right.
I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, there are two reasons that the conclusion becomes so state-based at the end, or one is, and if you're what they call a true Whig, and say Sam Adams was a true Whig, the Lee family in Virginia, Richard Henry Lee, they're all true Whigs. What they mean by that is any strong federal government in the new United States will be a replica of Parliament, and will be making the decision to recreate the very tyranny that we thought we were fighting to end and get an escape from. The second is that at the local level, and there's strong in writing pamphlets on this, political writing, but at the level that's not ideological, just experiential, the vast majority of Americans were born, lived out their lives, and died within a 3-day horse ride. They could not imagine, they could not think nationally. They could not think continental. That's what Hamilton said, you must learn to think continentally. That was not natural for them. A representative was someone you knew personally and who knew you, who was a neighbor. The notion that there's some person sitting in Philadelphia 150 miles away would represent you is foreign to them, okay? And so those are the two big reasons that something called the Articles of Confederation are the most that we can expect. And so if you're looking at the American founding, this is the first chapter. We're going to need a second chapter to get to the Constitution to nationalize these values. They're not ready to do that in 1783. And then you're going to need the 1790s, the third chapter, to consolidate that republic, which is unusual that they were able to do that. Most of them fail. One of the things I'm telling myself is, Joe, you've been writing the history of the American founding backwards. And you didn't know that's what you were doing, but you should have written this chapter first. However, if I had written this chapter 20 years ago when I started, or 23 years ago, I wouldn't have known as much, because I've had to I've written biographies of Washington and Jefferson and Adams, and it forces you into the papers and into the palpable details of it all in a way that I wouldn't have been able to master at that stage 23 years ago. So maybe it's the way to do it is backwards. And I, as a fellow historian writer, sometimes do you write the preface last?
Right.
Yes, you do.
Yeah,
you do. And because then you know where you're going.
right.
And
You know what it's about.
So this book is really the preface, or the first chapter in a series of books about the American founding, that is informed by what's happened since. But
Right.
it should have, they say chronology is the last refuge of the feeble-minded, but it's the only refuge for historians. And so I'm embarrassed to say I violated the chronological principle.
Well, I was just thinking that your book on Adams really focuses on Adams's retirement. So as
That's
Adams
right.
is looking back on,
He
all
looks
of
back a
this.
lot. Yeah. And the book called Passionate Sage, I like that. When I look back at that book now, I sometimes think, I don't know how I did that. And one of the things, though, that the listener should know is that if you're a biographer or a historian in which you're dealing with a lot of leaders and human beings, you are limited by what those people give you in the way of evidence. Washington's diary is about the weather.
Yeah.
The day that he retires from the presidency, you're looking at it and say, what did he say? What does he say? He said, temperature 38 degrees, a day like all days. You don't know what he's thinking. Adams always tells you what he's thinking. When he's talking about the weather, he's talking about the internal storms inside himself. And the correspondence between Abigail and John is unmatched in American history as a couple. You know this. And so, you know, you're partly a prisoner of what the evidence is and where you can, you know, what you find in it. And anyway, I do think, well, I'll stop there.
Well, you're too modest to say this, but I would like everyone to know that Passionate Sage is the best book about John Adams. So once you have finished The Cause, you should go to Northshire bookstore and order a copy of Passionate Sage.
You don't know this because it's very just, Norton has just decided to come up with a third edition.
Very good.
I don't know why they decided to do that, but I said, oh, okay. And they said, it means you got to write a new preface. And so I did. I just did it a couple of days ago. And
good.
Yeah. But I'm in the end, I'm an Adams guy. I mean, I love Jefferson, but he's going to let you down so many times. And I'm a Virginian, went to William and Mary, just like Jefferson, but my heart's with Adams and Abigail. And whenever I have a fight with my wife, who's from Mississippi, and I need to recover. I remember a line from Abigail. She's asked by her sister, if you had to do it over again, would you marry him, John? And she says, I cannot imagine suffering with anybody else. And my wife probably knows that phrase too. Yes.
I do want to remind folks who do have questions to put them in the chat and we'll get to them. You do have, you know, Adams appears here. He comes to see Washington and he's been reading Thucydides to prepare for military role.
You know, like he's appointed head of, well, the equivalent of Secretary of Defense or Secretary of War, head of, was it Ordnance? And his first thought is, send to Harvard Library for all the books on the Peloponnesian War and Thucydides. And, you know, can you imagine anybody in the current administration or any recent administration it's doing that? No. And can you imagine the Adams-Jefferson correspondence between any two subsequent presidents of the United States?
No.
I think it was John Adams's grandson, Henry Adams. Is that his grandson? Yes.
Great-grandson.
Great-grandson, thank you.
Or great-great-grandson.
No, it's just one, I think. I hope we'll figure, but somebody will correct this. He says, if you had to look at the history of the American presidency, you'd have to concern that Darwin got it exactly backward. And there's some truth to that. Though
there may be.
It's really easy. I mean, well, anyway, my view on the founders is they're the greatest generation of political leaders we've had. They're this gold standard. They're all flawed. They all made mistakes, and as a group, they made some big ones. What I want to write about next is a book called What Kind of Tragedy? Why the Founders Failed to End Slavery. And I don't know the answer to this question. I think I might have mentioned it a little earlier. Is it a Greek tragedy
or Shakespearean
tragedy? And could it have gone the other way? Were there opportunities to end it? And I don't know I could go either way on that. I'm going to let's see the evidence take shape. But there is a movement afoot inside the profession. I know you're aware of it, but a reinterpretation of the American Revolution as part of the 1776 movement. I have no problem believing that that slavery is America's original sin and that racism is its toxic residue still very much with us, more than I ever realized until Trump. But I think both 16 and 19 and 1776 don't really work when you start looking closely. And what they argue about 76 is the war was fought to preserve or protect slavery. I have enormous trouble with that, and will devote the rest of my life to making sure that people know that there's an alternative view of that. And there's a reason why Martin Luther King, when he stepped up to the Lincoln Memorial to deliver the "I Have a Dream" speech, says, "I've come to collect on a promissory note written by Thomas Jefferson." So I see the American Revolution as the big bang in American history, and from it radiates the feminist movement and the civil rights movement as well. And if you want to tell a story of how bad Americans are, as a sort of a negative view of American history, you're going to have to go over me.
You say the entire history of liberal reform in the United States can be written as a process of discovery within Jefferson's words of a mandate for ending slavery, providing rights of citizenship, and protecting a full range of individual freedom. It's again, beautifully written. The entire book is beautifully written, interesting, compelling. And so I'm really happy to be here talking about it with this.
I don't know about how long it takes you. I'd be interested, but a lot of the historians that I know, and I am a professional historian, as are you, they spend about 2/3 of their time doing research and 1/3 doing the writing. I think I almost reversed that. And in fact, it's not a totally separate process. A lot of times you don't know where to go until you start writing, and then you realize, oh no, I don't want to do that anymore. But I care a lot about how the book reads, and sometimes when I get angry at some of my colleagues, I say, how come you claim to care so much about ordinary people in the present? I mean, in the past, ordinary people in the past, and you don't know how to write books that can be read by ordinary people in the present. Fortunately, I was good at languages, but I never learned academese. And my mentors at Yale were C. Van Woodward and Edmund Morgan, and they let me go. They said, "Go to it, baby." And I got an invitation from the Columbia School of Journalism at one point when Founding Brothers came out, and they said they'd assigned the first chapter in that called "The Duel" to talk about how to tell a story. And then she started telling me about all these wonderful things that happened in this chapter, like you doubled back here, and then you literary criticism, deconstructed this, and then you did that. And I said, "Ma'am, I'm telling you, I can't come down and help you because I don't know what the hell you're talking about." And I just tried to tell the story, and I don't know how it turned out that way, but that's how it turned out, And so how it reads is really important to me. Too many academic reviews don't even mention that. And but I really think that I hope people find that, when I started this, I wasn't sure. Can I still do it? I'm getting up there, And I'm married to a younger woman, so I don't realize how old I am. And I said, "Can you really do it? Tell the story with the same?" And based on the Zooming I've been doing, I think the answer is yes.
I think so too.
I think the answer is yes. That's what I'm hearing anyway. And I'm hearing it from you and hearing it from others, and I trust you. You'll tell me the truth because you've told me the truth before, sometimes when I don't like it. And and I hope that Northshire sells a million copies because I want them to become the most successful private library in America.
You now live not too far from Northshire.
I do. We're moving up to Vermont. We lived in Amherst for many years, and my wife Ellen and I and our dogs, we're just getting a new dog today. We
Wow.
got one Labradoodle, and my wife is coming back from North Carolina with the second Labradoodle. Now get this, the current Labradoodle is a girl called Lucy, and the new one is a boy called Desi. So it's going to be Lucy and Desi. And we're going to live up here. We're going to expand this place a little bit. We're about 50 minutes from Manchester, on top of a mountain, though it doesn't look like Monticello, I can tell you right now.
You're not going to call it Monticello or Montezio?
No, Monticello means little mountain, but Adams never even knew that's what it meant. You know, he said his place was Montezillo,
Yeah.
you know, he's so great.
Yeah.
So
I've
we've got some
listened to
great
both of
audience.
you all night. Well, go ahead, Rachel.
I was just going to say, we have some audience questions coming in and we're running low on time. So I'd love to quickly get to a couple of those. Shelley asked, you mentioned Joseph Brant earlier, but can you speak about other Indigenous people during the American Revolution? And were there some interesting personalities among them who haven't given their due attention?
I haven't paid much attention to the specific personalities of other Indigenous people. I do mention the chief of the Oneida, who's called Grasshopper, and Washington invites him to be present at Yorktown. I mean, people that want to do Native American history, and that's a huge number of people in the profession now. I say that's wonderful. We need to recover their story too, but their story's not the whole story. They're a single part of, they're one pane in the window. They're not the whole window. And a lot of people who do Native Americans and they teach the survey in American history, it's all, you know, the students don't know about the Stamp Act or the Federalist Papers, but they know about the Iroquois Confederation. I think that the Iroquois Confederation needs to be absorbed into the main narrative. That's what I would say to them, and but not pretend that it is the main narrative.
There's a question here from John. He says, how do you suggest we judge or consider Aaron Burr's complicated legacy?
Yeah, Burr is, you know, if you said, what person in the founding comes closest to Donald Trump, it would be Burr. And he doesn't make it. I mean, and Burr's, you know, Burr is the grandson of Jonathan Edwards, and went to Princeton, well educated, but he had, the reason that the duel happens is because Hamilton and he both had such grand visions of what they were both going to do that they were almost duplicates of each other. But Burr is the most pure feminist among the founders. He raises his daughter to be a fully educated woman, and so they're like, once you get into the life of any single person, you're going to see complexities, and Burr has them. I think in some ways one of the best books is not a biography. It's a novel by Gore Vidal, and it's called Burr. And he speculates on all kinds of things in ways that historians aren't supposed to do. But Burr is the one guy who is a demagogue, a real demagogue. Anything else out there?
There's a great comment here from Carol. She says, thank you so much for this wonderful event. It's been an enlightening evening and a delight, but it's 7 o'clock. And as I said, I think we could listen to, I'd be happy to listen to both of y'all go on for another couple hours. But
see, if we were there, we could do that. If we were there,
yeah,
we could do that, you know, but we can't. And you did the right thing for this, and obviously, but I'm looking forward to the day when I can show up over there. We can have a big crowd and just talk all night. I would think that would be great.
Me too.
Us too.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for having me. Thank my colleague for making me seem like I know what I'm doing. And remember, he's got a book coming out on the Constitution, the ship,
Right.
And remember, I'm promising Northshire that you've got my loyalty forever from now on.
Mine too.
Well, thank you both so much. This has been fantastic. Thank you, audience, for being here. And you can order both books discussed tonight at northshire.com and check out our calendar of upcoming events. Thanks, everyone, and have a great weekend.
Let's wait and see if they want to say anything. I don't think they will. No, they did have a lot of people there, huh? Well, then I talk.